So that's it for me. Thank you all for coming, and take it away, guys.
Thanks, Lisa.
You're welcome.
So can everybody hear me okay? So I'll amplify just a little bit for those in the back. So thanks for that introduction. So as you know, today will be recorded. So you'll be able to access. They haven't told us how you'll get to that secret spot wherever this will be hidden, but you'll get access to it after it's over. Also, too, for anyone who uses Twitter, if you feel the need to, there's a kind of a national dialogue around UDL occurring right now that Memorial's been a part of for quite a while. So if you want to tune out for a minute and check your feed, feel free. But if you use hashtag UDL Canada, that kind of captures a number of initiatives that are going on across the country, including what's going on here as well. So we've also placed our presentation in as a Google Doc in our Drive. So if you want to scan that code, I'll just leave it up for a sec, or you can certainly put in the URL, but you'll just find our presentation and the links embedded within there, and you can just kind of scroll through if you like. Okay, so just some objectives today to help guide our discussion and our session. First of all, again, consistent with transformative learning, we're going to ask you to critically reflect on traditional course design and teaching practices that are currently in use in post-secondary teaching. We're going to ask you to challenge, or we're going to challenge our assumptions about today's learners and today's learning spaces, whether that's classrooms or field schools or laboratories. And then also we want to thoughtfully consider how universal design for learning can transform learning experiences for all learners. And I want to highlight that, and that'll become clear as we move along, that this is really meant for all learners and not just certain parts of the student demographic. Okay, so just as a brief outline to hopefully where we get to go today, I'm going to address this idea of the mythical average learner. So when we design our courses, who are we designing them for? And generally we default to this average learner who will be able to read a textbook, take an exam, write a paper, and finish the course. So we're going to look at that idea, challenge that a little bit, and see really who our learners are and how should we be tackling both course design and then also teaching practice to maybe be more inclusive or accessible. We'll just do a very brief introduction to universal design, and if there are any architects or engineers in the room who can weigh in on that very basic understanding of universal design, that would be great. We'll then tie it to really the educational component behind this universal design, and that's universal design for learning. There's a number of models that use universal design in instruction and course design, but we focus solely here on universal design for learning. We'll then look at some of the cognitive neuroscience that supports this framework for designing courses and teaching. Gabrielle will bring us through that. Ailsa is going to talk about what it means to accommodate. So this idea of accommodations, which we're very familiar with. They used to be the big yellow sheets of paper. Now they're emails that we get from students who have registered with our disability service provider, the Blunden Center. But what we're going to look at and kind of unpack the idea of accommodating. And then finally, Ailsa is going to bring us through a discussion around universal design for learning and social justice and some of the implications from a social justice perspective. So can I just get an idea of who are our UDL experts in the room? How about our intermediate kind of UDLers? Don't be humble, don't be shy. How about, yeah, I would say I'm an intermediate kind of user. Beginner? Pre-beginner. All right, wonderful. All right, so the first thing I want to do, I have the luxury of being able to connect this idea of universal design for learning to the theme of the conference, which is transformative learning. And throughout our session, we will, of course, refer to kind of those traditional conceptions of transformative learning, so Mezirow and his contemporaries. But we also will connect this work to a recent conception in the last 10, 15 years by Janik, who looked at a brain-based theory. And this theory looks at the idea that learning is rooted in students' experiences, needs, and interests, And then Taylor outlines that it's strengthened by emotive, sensory, and kinesthetic experience, which you'll see blends very well with the UDL framework. The nice thing about this particular conception of transformative learning is it acknowledges variability between learners. And we're going to talk about variability, probably all three of us will talk about that, as opposed to talking about disability and absence of a disability, right? So having that kind of binary, we look at variability and the research, the neuroscience research on UDL kind of acknowledges and confirms that everyone learns differently. And so it presents this idea of learner variability. And then finally, this particular conception of transformative learning demands that educators acquire understanding of neurobiological systems and how those implicate, or how they are implicated in classrooms. Okay, so just going to talk briefly for a second about this idea of the mythical average learner. So this is, again, as I mentioned earlier, this is the learner that we're thinking about when we design our courses or when we deliver our courses. This is the student that's going to be able to access a physical textbook, read a physical textbook, complete an exam, write a paper, and complete the course. So I want to walk us through a conception of who those learners are at Memorial. And so do we actually have these types of learners, this mythical average? So let's kind of interrogate that a little bit. So this is our classroom. We have 100 students. About 100 seats in this room. So if we just look at this classroom and say, listen, everybody's kind of the same. They can all access a textbook, a physical textbook. They're going to be able to write a midterm, and they're going to be able to write a final. And so everybody's going to get through this course. This is who we start with. This is who we're thinking about. But if we think about just disability, so, given the numbers that we have now and the stats are available, this is about how many students would be registered with the Bulletin Center. So these are the students that have identified, self-identified, as a student needing an accommodation of whatever sort. But what we know from the research is that between 60 and 80% of students with disabilities on any post-secondary campus don't register with the disability service provider. So really what you're looking at is this. So these are students with formally diagnosed learning difficulties, some kind of a disability that's going to impact or could potentially impact on their performance in the classroom. But again, it's not just about disability. So if we look at the research, we know that 1 in 7 students may work full-time. And they're going to have, we know again from the literature, they're going to have different needs in our classrooms and our labs than this mythical average student. We also know that about 26% of undergraduate students nationally may be parents. And so they have issues that may be above and beyond what we think about when we think about that mythical average learner. First-generation students, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous first-generation students. And then we look at what UDL kind of captures as learner variability amongst all the other students that we think are the average learners, and they're really not. So if we look at this constellation now of learner, very different from the one that we start with when we design this course, when we pick our textbook, when we pick our resources, when we choose our assessment methods. This is what we're thinking about, and this is really who we're designing these courses for. Okay, so let's say, yep, great. We understand every student learns differently. There is evidence to suggest that every learner learns differently. It's as different as their DNA. So what do we do now? So this whole idea of universal design was one that came about in the 60s and 70s. It originated in architecture and engineering, and it was basically how can we make products, environments more accessible, originally for individuals with disabilities, but it quickly morphed into, hey, everybody can access this a little more easily. Everybody can use this, and it's not just for those particular users that we had originally intended. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with the principles, but there are 7 principles of universal design. So this is, again, right from architecture and engineering. So we have equitable use, flexibility in use, simple and intuitive, perceptible information, tolerance for error, see a nail gun. So you want to make sure that you can't accidentally hurt yourself. low physical effort, and size and space for approach and use. So these are from architecture. They're used to design mostly physical built environments. But what happened was we want to look at how can we take these principles and apply them to an educational experience or a learning environment. And so here's a wonderful definition out of our friends from the Center for Applied Special Technologies around universal design, and one that they've kind of used to build and guide their decision-making around universal design for learning. So they say the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation and specialized design. When we think about that in a learning environment, that's our accommodations. So those are the students that are formally recognized by our university, by our disability service providers, as having a need for an accommodation. So how can we design our classrooms, design our curricula, without having to rely on, we won't eliminate, but how can we do so that we won't have to simply rely on that accommodation process? So how can we take principles of universal design and apply them here or here? And this brings us to this whole idea of universal design for learning, which Gabe will walk us through. And I'll give you my mic.
Thank you, Jason. Awesome. Well, I have two goals for today. I just wanted to, first of all, welcome and say thank you to Jason for making this possible, and then to make sure that I don't take up too much of Ailsa's time. So I will speak to the theories behind universal design for learning, some of the research behind it, and then Ailsa will talk to the emotive component of it. So universal design is an educational framework, and it's based on the neuroscience, and it stems from more of a social model versus a medical model. So a medical model would say that something's wrong with the individual, whereas proponents of universal design say that we recognize that somehow the way in which we structure our learning environment is disabling. So it asks the individual to take a little bit of onus on themselves to reflect, think about how they present information, how they use groupings, how they use choice to motivate and reach students where they are. Because like Jason said, there's no typical traditional learner. And so we have students with disabilities, but also students that may have kids screaming throughout the night, and for that day need a little bit of lenience when they enter into the information. So it's really how we think about how we create flexible learning environments to accommodate individual difference. The three proponents of three main pillars of universal design for learning is that you make sure that you are first touching on the affective domain, giving students the opportunity to understand how what they're learning relates to past information and their prior knowledge, and how they'll be able to use that in the future. You're ensuring that students have multiple ways to access and engage with the material, so you're not just speaking, you're presenting visuals, you've got perhaps short introductory videos that students could read before engaging in book chapters or more in-depth journal articles. And also you're ensuring that you're making students have the opportunity to demonstrate what they know in a variety of low-risk opportunities before they're asked to be formally assessed. So we're ensuring that students have the opportunity to talk about a certain task, engage in group projects, demonstrate what they know through a case-based type activity before there's high-stakes testing. So as Jason mentioned, UDL did stem from architecture. In 1970s, the American government said it's wrong to discriminate people against people based on race, ethnicity, disability, and that moved that concept into education, and so the idea, or into building development. The idea was that when I went to school, you would have schools, and when the schools got too big, you would build portables, and the portables would have stairs, and the portables would have ramps, right? And so all these steps after the fact are timely, expensive, ugly, and so if all main foyers are built accessible from the get-go, you don't have to build those ramps that go all the way around, right? So it's thinking about how we design environments and structures to be accessible to all from the get-go. This transitioned into education, and Canada often follows suit from American counterparts. So in 1998, it was declared in Canada illegal to discriminate due to disability. and that has to do with how buildings are accessible, how text is made accessible. So by law, any textbook that's available in hard copy also has to be available electronically in alternate text format for accessibility purposes. What the research says is that when it comes to inclusion or students with disabilities being educated in the mainstream or the inclusive classroom, research shows that it does not have a negative impact on their peers without disabilities. And when teachers are supported and they're given a framework or pillars to kind of structure their education, it has a positive impact on the way teachers perceive their instruction and a positive impact on student achievement as well. So if there's a take-home message, think about how you can present information in multiple ways, give students multiple ways to demonstrate what they know. And while this was originally the third principle, CAST asks you now to think first about how you'll engage students, how you'll hook them, how you'll make sure they understand how what they're learning is relevant. So hook students first, teach them in multiple formats, and ensure they have multiple ways to demonstrate what they know. So UDL recognizes that there's innate differences in individuals. We can vary teaching strategies in regards to the form, level of difficulty, and manner of presentation. You can give choice to students. Oftentimes when you're lecturing and engaging in dialogue, you engage in different kind of questioning and vary that degree of difficulty to make sure that you are engaging with all students. You can use a variety of technology to ensure that students can access the text. Oftentimes something as simple as using D2L to support a face-to-face class is quite effective because it gives students a chance to access the material, it supports organization, it allows students to read at their own pace, and take the time to reflect in dialogue. And through involving a range of media, formats, and response options, students have more of a chance of demonstrating what it is they truly know. So the Center for Applied Special Education and Technology, CAST, has been really innovative in regards to how they're pushing their research on UDL to the forefront. So write that down, cast.org, if you wanted to visit their site. They actually outline the 3DL principles, what they look like in action, and provide the research behind it. What we do know is that there's a push across high schools and post-secondary institutions to utilize more digital media and think about how we can use technology to support inclusive learning environments. You could provide whole lectures on this. But before I get into the brain research behind this, I just want to ask you to think about how you can use electronic text to make fonts accessible, how you can use text readers to allow students that might be easily distracted to hear information as they read. Research actually shows that if students are reading and pointing and following along, it can actually increase their reading and their decoding skills over time. So I'm an elementary teacher, but just note that even in the post-secondary environments, there are some benefits of text-to-speech for comprehension. And when individuals are doing writing tasks, if they have handwriting difficulties, difficulties with spelling or written expression, voice-to-text is a great option. So I'm still doing okay on time. So cognitive neuroscience is interdisciplinary. It's a really new discipline. It gets its underpinnings from cognitive psychology, sociology, anthropology. And the field is designed to really look at what's happening in the brain and how that can be applied to education or other fields. What researchers in this field are saying is that the brain is composed of a bunch of cognitive neural structures, and these neural connections and functional connectivity measures how things work. So fMRI studies are actually able to put little plugs on individuals' brain, ask individuals to engage in specific tasks, and figure out which components of the brain are activated while engaging in these tasks. And so from these fMRI and brain-based studies, we're actually able to see that there are 3 distinct networks in the brain. The what of learning, the recognition section, which is how you receive, analyze, process information. The strategic network involves the executive functioning, how you see a task through to completion. And the affective network, how you see the relevance of something, how you motivate yourself and see yourself through to that task completion. So just as there are 3 pillars of UDL, we're finding that there's 3 different networks of the brain, and these components are activated when doing various neural tasks. So the recognition network, again, when you're presenting information in different ways, such as through PowerPoints, handouts, or videos, that impacts how we gather, categorize what we see, and identifying an author's styles of recognition task. When we give a variety of ways for students to demonstrate what they know, whether it's through exams, presentations, we're activating the strategic network. So organizing and learning how to express ourselves, those are all strategic tasks. And we're engaging students, when we're motivating them, we're impacting the affective network. So there's beginning to be a little bit of research behind UDL and the connections to neuroscience. So proponents of UDL would say that there are 3 broad divisions of the brain. However, there's some controversies with this. Proponents of UDL would say that you can maximize learners by supporting the affective, the network, and the strategic domains of learning. However, other individuals will say the brain's complex. Not one individual or individual component of the brain is specifically involved in one task, but rather neurons are working together across tasks. So it's important to know that it's a new field. It's slightly based on neuroscience, but there's much more to learn. So it's hard to say that universal design for learning will have sound, effective, immediate impact on achievement. There is some research saying that students with and without disabilities enjoy the learning tasks more. And when teachers think about universal design for learning, they think about teacher-student variance. And when they plan accordingly, they can better develop student relationships and meet the needs of their students. So the research is kind of conflicting. However, what the research soundly says is that student engagement and learner perception will be positive impacted if lessons are planned with UDL in mind. And again, a lot of research looking at how universal design for learning supports blended learning environments. And this is actually something to really consider, given that research does demonstrate that there's higher than average dropout rates in online environments. So that's all I have to say. I'm going to pass it on to Ailsa.
Not unless you announce it, no. So how does this work?
One in your pocket, one in your pad.
Pocket propel. Can you hear me? We're good? Okay. And Jason's going to laugh at me. I just clicked the forward button to make it go forward, yes? Right. Me and technology, it's fantastic. We go back in time. All right, okay. So I'm going to go get my chalk because I can work with chalk. So, first of all, I just want to thank Jason and Gabrielle for the opportunity to work with them on this, and I want to thank all of you for being here. I come to universal design through a social justice lens, and I want to finish off the session today giving us a chance to talk about the idea of accommodation as a way to further understand the social justice dimensions of UDL. So in order to do this, I'd like to give us a chance to engage in our own process of transformative learning in hopes that it can help us with critically reflecting on the material and the ideas that Jason and Gabrielle have presented on UDL in a way that might result in a change in our own perspectives that could lead to a change in what we do as teachers. So if you've been following along with all the talk about transformative learning, I'm going to try and do it with you today. So we'll see if it works or not. It's worth a shot in any case. So one of the things that I've done in terms of curriculum here at MUN, I'm in the sociology department, is design a course in the sociology of disability. And if you're coming to the panel session on UDL that's directly following this, yes? Yeah, right after the break. Are we still in this room? Okay, see, Jason knows everything. It'll be in this room, and it'll be the three of us, and also Catherine Shortle and Jen Dion is going to be joining us. If you come to that session, you'll hear a little bit more about that and how it was designed and how it was implemented, all the rest of it. I'm not going to get into that here. That course does, though, as you might expect, use UDL because as a disability course, how could it not, right? would be a little bit inconsistent. But it also uses UDL and came to UDL as part of expressing a commitment to student-centered learning, and that is part of the sort of social justice impetus, along with the fact that it just wouldn't make sense, given the content of the course, not to do that. So in that course, we spend a lot of time thinking and talking about different forms of accommodation. And there are a bunch of different ways that we end up talking about it throughout the course of the term. So we're going to do some of that thinking. So my apologies to the one person in the room who has taken the course, because you've done this before. We're going to do some of that work today in order to try and move through some of the ideas that we've been talking about with Jason and Gabrielle. So reasonable accommodations. You can see my politics in my doubt quotes. This is when we get to turn to chalk, and I'll immediately become more comfortable. So the first thing that I wanted to ask you is, what do you think of? What's the first thing that you think of when you think about the idea of accommodations? What are accommodations? Okay, so I am entirely aware that my handwriting is completely inaccessible. Okay? But I will know. And my mic is falling out. So long as my pants don't fall off, I think we're in good form. So, is that better? Am I back wired? Okay. So, accommodations. That you're doing something different. Anything else? What kinds of things? Yes? Create equity. Yes. They're unfair. Inconvenient. What else? Increasing. There, you get a symbol. What are things that you can think of as examples of accommodations? So you think, like, what is an accommodation? What might some of those? Pardon me? More time? More time in a quiet room. Okay. I would personally love, just generally in my life, more time in a quiet room. But anything else? Yes? Alternate formats. Special seating. You're worried I'm going to step on your phone.
I'm going to capture this and throw it in the Google Drive.
Oh, okay. But nobody can read it, Jason.
Well, we'll
There's not a hope in hell.
We'll translate it and put it in the
Oh, will you? I mean, can you just follow me around in life whenever I have a piece of chalk then? Sorry. And, yes?
Somebody else is responsible.
Okay, yeah. What was that? Okay, yes. So do you want the doubt quotes? Yeah. Okay. No, that is true. That is often, that's a common response, the idea of accommodations. Anybody else want to throw? It costs so much, doesn't it? You said really in a way that made I had to write it 3 times. Anything else that you think of when you think of the idea of accommodations? A note taker? Yep.
Another one for the quotes. Doing your favors.
Okay, yeah. Uh-huh. That's a really good one to include here, actually, Beth. I don't like the chords. I'm facing a barrier, and I don't like it. Okay, sorry. All right. Any last thoughts? Yes, Jen.
Diagnosis and proper paperwork.
Oh, yes, paperwork. Okay. Are we good with that? I think that we've got enough there to work with. So a lot of this, particularly what I want to pull out of this, are the kinds of things that we think of as when I encourage you to say, so what are examples of different accommodations? So that we've got a quiet room, a note taker, extra time, alternative formats or alternate formats, those kinds of things, which tend to be put in place as accommodations. What does a classroom with no accommodations look like? What would it look like if you had a class go forward that didn't have any accommodations? What's that? Empty? Well, what am I supposed to do with that? Work with me. What would a classroom look like if there were no accommodations in place? Pardon me? Traditional? Okay, so maybe that's a better way to phrase this then. Can we, did I do it again? Is it gone? Oh no, it's there. Sorry. What's on my chest? I don't know. So what does a traditional classroom look like? What, everything's the same? So all the same in terms of so delivery, expectations, schedule, assessment. Anything else, or does that sort of encapsulate it? Right? Okay. Does that classroom exist? Not really. That classroom, which we all recognize, right, which in some ways is this classroom, if we want to look at it physically, this classroom if we stand here and look, right? So we don't have to move that far into the room to look and see the standard classroom. So here we have an accommodation. So we have space for, what, 2 people? Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Wow, that's so inclusive. Sarcasm is a teaching tool. Okay, so this is a traditional classroom in some ways. It is already built to accommodate some people, right? So it's not really that it has no accommodations. We think of it as having no accommodations. But physically and otherwise, even though we don't acknowledge it, there are some people that are already accommodated by what exists, right? So why might that be that we don't acknowledge the accommodations that are there? Why don't we think of it? Why do we just, why is it that so often in our doubt quotes, why is it so often we think of it, this is just the normal. This is just a classroom. It's just what it is. Why don't we see who it allows in? Yes? Gabrielle?
No, someone else. It seems normative to like accommodate mobility issues, but sometimes we think about accommodating invisible difficulties and learning challenges. I think that's what
Yeah. So there's that, but also we don't see the accommodations that are made for people who are already structurally in positions of privilege, right? We don't see that at all. So it's tricky because one of the simplest definitions of privilege that you can give is that when you have privilege, there are no barriers, right? When you have privilege, it's privilege that means that the way is clear for you, right? So what do you see when the way is clear? Nothing. That's the whole point, right? So it's just the norm, but what I'm trying to talk about here is how the norm isn't neutral. So if we don't work to understand privilege, then we're unlikely to be able to adequately address exclusion and inequality in teaching and learning design and in our classrooms. So the issue is not that we don't have accommodating classrooms, right? That's not the issue at all. It's that we're always accommodating some people And we tend to accommodate some people over other people without even being conscious of the fact that we're doing so. And that is what creates unfair advantage, if you want to talk about what's unfair. But look, I even can circle as if I'm writing on the board, but I'm not. So we need to be conscious of what accommodations we're making. And this is really central to social justice concerns. And UDL principles can help us to be more conscious of that. And if we trust the people who can see the barriers, because they are living with the barriers in the path, to make choices about how they are going to be able to more effectively move through their own learning, then that is social justice, right? That's something that is taking seriously that people are the center of their own lives, right? That they are the experts in their own lives, and that it's our job not to deliver a course, but to create a learning environment, right? And if we can be student-centered in that way, and then use some of the principles in UDL, particularly when you talked about like really specific principles, so that you can say, okay, I understand universal design, something that's more accessible. What does that mean? How do you put it into practice, right? How do you be more student-centered? How do you do this? Well, here, turn to UDL, right? It's got things that you can say, have I done this? Have I done that? So that you can find a way to put it into practice more easily. With UDL, we don't decide in advance who our students are, and we don't decide in advance what they're going to bring to the table, which means that when we're able to incorporate UDL into our teaching, we're creating ways to have students be more consciously involved in building the learning communities that they're a part of, and that it's our job to foster. And we increase the possibilities of transformative learning by including them in building that community with us, right? And then also, we've got a better chance of actually learning from our students, engaging in transformative learning ourselves, and being better at what we do. And thank you. I'm 1 minute under.
So are there questions? I have 2 microphones, but we need to capture your voice for the folks that are going to, the millions of people who are going to watch us later.
Dr. Craig, can you give us an example, a practical example of the last point on your previous slide, please?
Can I remember the last point on my previous slide? Thank you. What year are we in now? Okay, so the last point?
Yes, please.
An example of how it doesn't decide in advance who your students are or what they bring to the table?
I like that point. I really like that point. But I can't capture it visibly, like in my mind. I can't see it in the picture.
So one of the things, I had a professor when I was in undergrad who looked at me one day when I told him something about what was going on in my life that was affecting my performance in school. And he said, Ailsa, you've made me realize how much I usually only see my students through a fog. Thank you for stepping out of the fog so I can see where you're coming from, right? And that's really stayed with me as a teacher over the years. The fact that we don't know what our students' priorities are, what their experiences are, what they're bringing to the table, right? And that in some ways, we will often build courses as if our priorities are our students' priorities. And that's one of the ways where Jesper Rox and Richard Arm have a book about what's failing in higher education that talks about how it's this mismatch of priorities, which is part of the problem. So with universal design, if you're not deciding in advance who your students are, it means you're not deciding in advance what their time looks like, how they're able to access the materials, right? So one example of how to do that, something that I did in the disability course, is having there be options for assessment so that people can look at it. So rather than having people come to you and having to declare and have the paperwork and do all of this, everybody has to make a choice. Universally, that's part of what everybody in the class has to do. They have to make a choice. Why they make that choice is none of my business, right? It might be because they're a single parent. It might be because, you know what, I'm doing 5 courses and everything is due that week, so I'm going to do this instead, right? It might be, I can do this many papers and this many exams, and I don't have any flexibility in my other courses, right? So we don't know what people are bringing to the table. So if we give people options and allow them to be the experts on their own lives so that they are actually part of the learning community in terms of building what's happening, then that means we haven't assumed that we know who they are before they walk into the room. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so an option could be an option in terms of assessment and measuring outcome. So do this assignment or do a quiz. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah, and that can be around timing, and that can be around the kinds of work that people do. And the way to make sure that that is fair among students when people are doing things differently is you think about what are the outcomes that I'm measuring, and what are different things that people could do to show that, right? If I want students to be able to apply a concept, they can either write an exam, right? Or they can make a curated YouTube film festival with commentary, right? Or they can do an oral presentation for the class. Or they can do journal reflections throughout the whole term, right? And for all of those things, what I'm assessing is, are you applying the course concepts?
Would you have a rubric for each of those pathways?
It's usually pretty much the same. Interestingly, it's the same rubric for each pathway, because we all know that you can get to standing right here from walking in a bunch of different directions. Are you standing here? Do you know the material? Have you ended up where we're hoping to get you by the end of the course? Does that make sense?
It does. So in other words, you're meeting the objective.
Yes. Welcome.
Just coming back to that we were just discussing, one of the things with students when you do that, students learn about themselves, and you got to it takes a lot of patience, because when you give them those options, sometimes they go, oops, and I didn't like that, and then they'll change for the next time, or they may ask, a lot of times in secondary school, they say, like, why don't you just do it again a different way, since you didn't like it that way.
Yep.
That requires a lot of patience. But I mean, and especially when you've got like a semester that's squished instead of like a whole year. I mean,
Yep. That is true.
That's a really good point. I think of the example in the nursing faculty that we have to do skill labs. So in other words, you have to learn how to put in an IV. So we gave them the option of doing it in real time or videotaping themselves. A lot of students chose the latter, and they found it
so the memories from that super good. So, you know, you're like, sorry, it took so long that you're going to you'll do that a gazillion times over. Anybody else?
Great. So Ailsa had mentioned, or Gabrielle had mentioned, so there's a panel after this, following the break. There's a nutrition break, and then we have a panel. And if you're really interested in what this looks like, or what it has looked like, we've all kind of designed courses, and again, as intermediate users, or depending on where you are on the spectrum of being looking at UDL and your teaching, we all have different examples, and we also have the student perspective. So on the panel, we'll have a very important student voice there, and that will be able to speak to how students experience these courses, and how different they are, and how they just know when they're in a room or they look through that syllabus, this course is just different. And again, it's not about disability, which normally it is. You have a disability or you don't, and that's how you navigate the course. So it'll be really interesting if you want to see and hear how this plays out, at least across a couple of faculties here, and I'm sure there are other faculty members who are doing this, but it would be really interesting to come to the panel. It's in the same room, and bring your questions, bring your challenges, because we will have questions for our panelists that really challenge some myths around, or fallacies around UDL, particularly around rigor, academic rigor, and making it still challenging. And can you have a challenging course that's designed universally? Spoiler, I think we would argue you could, and we do teach that way, and we do have these courses that are rigorous. So if there's no other questions, we're a little early, so I think the next step is a nutrition break. So I think you get the best yogurts and fruit that are available. And we hope to see you back here at 3:05.
I don't want to stop you from the yogurts and fruit, but around that, I had a business student who took the disability course that I designed as an elective, who told me 3/4 of the way through class, I got to confess, I took this because it had no prerequisites, which I did to make sure that anybody could take it who was interested. I thought it was going to be a bird course. Wow, I was really wrong, but this is really cool.